top engine rebuild begins with removing the muffler. Loosening the radiators and moving them forward makes room for pipe removal from the engine cylinder head. Exhaust pipe nuts removed, the pipes can now be slid forward and pulled away from the engine. Protect the radiators when you remove the pipe. Drop the skid plate and drain the cooling system by removing this bolt from the water pump. Loosening the radiator cap will allow full flow of coolant. Coolant drained, remove the clutch cable. Move the clutch and other cables out of the way. Put hardware back in place where possible. Loosen the breather hose, then loosen the triangle brackets that support the upper end of the engine. There are 3 bolts with nuts. Remove the compression release cable and bracket. Again, tuck the cable and bracket up and away from the engine. Remove the 4 bolts that hold on the rocker covers and place these parts safely aside. If you're at top dead center on the compression stroke, the rockers should all be loose. Remove the rocker box 6mm bolts. Loosen them evenly. Keep track of bolts with copper sealing washers and make sure they get reinstalled in their proper locations. Remove the 2 8mm bolts last and rock the rocker box slightly to loosen the rocker box from the dowels. Remove the rocker box carefully and don't scratch the mating surfaces. Remove locating dowels. Now carefully remove the chain tensioner, loosening the bolts evenly. Make sure the tensioner slides out freely. You can now remove the camshaft sprocket. There are 2 bolts 180 degrees apart. Make sure you don't drop parts down into the crankcase. Rotate the crankshaft and the camshaft by turning the flywheel. Lift the sprocket out carefully as you remove the camshaft and bearing. Hold on to the bearing. I accidentally dropped it between the chain halves, which is not a problem. The bearing cannot fall into the crankcase from this position. I removed the dowel pin and the bearing with a magnet. Remove the retainer for the oil plunger and spring. Remove dowels and set pins and keep track of their locations. Support the chain, don't let it drop into the crankcase. I use a 6-point deep set impact socket to loosen the 4 14mm nuts. Loosen them uniformly, just a few turns at a time. This will eliminate the risk of warping the head or distorting it during removal. Keep track of the washers. Don't let any hardware fall into the crankcase. If necessary, remove the washers with a magnet or leave them in place and be careful when you remove the head. There are 4 cylinder and head hold down long studs, nuts, and washers. I use mechanics wire to hold the chain up. The wire is running upward to the handlebar cross brace. Keep track of all hardware. Lay it out so that it can go back together the same way it came apart. Now I gently tap the cylinder head upward with a plastic sand-filled hammer. Use extreme care not to damage the aluminum casting. Loosen the water elbow on the opposite side of the head and remove the carburetor and rubber intake manifold. Head loose from the dowels, chain in place, lift the head upward. Clear the studs and use extreme caution not to damage the mating surface between the head and the cylinder as you lift the head out of position and away from the frame. Now you can detach the mechanics wire from the handlebar and slide the wire through the head. The head is free. See the excessive carbon buildup from valves that were not seating properly and compression was low. The Nickel can be carefully examined in the cylinder now, and the cylinder ridge shows glazing and damage from debris running through the upper cylinder and combustion chamber. Compression was obviously low in this engine. Now I loosen the bolts that hold the cylinder to the crankcase. I'll gently tap the cylinder upward using a sand-filled plastic hammer. Do not damage castings and make sure all hardware is loose. Lift the chain guide out of the cylinder. Raise the cylinder barrel carefully, making sure you protect the piston and connecting rod. Lift it straight up. Watch that I'm using the heel of my hand to gently set the piston down on the crankcase ledge. I'll now slide the chain and mechanics wire through the cylinder barrel and place the chain carefully down on the side of the crankcase. Holding the cylinder barrel squarely, I gently pry the lower portion of the cylinder barrel through the two studs without damaging the studs or lower cylinder barrel. We can now examine the cylinder barrel. The nickel is intact in most areas of the wall, but up in the ridge area you can see the scoring damage and signs of abuse from debris running through the upper cylinder. This engine was running an extremely lean main jet. The heat in the cylinder is obvious, and the lower portion of the cylinder is showing skirt drag from the piston, although there's no sign of seizure on either the piston or the cylinder barrel, and that's a good thing. There's no damage to the engine beyond the upper cylinder wear and the valves, which show an excessive amount of carbon and are obviously leaking. This engine had proper lubrication and quality oil, and with liquid cooling, excessive damage did not occur from running the exceptionally lean jet. Spark plug thread damage that required the installation of the time cert was likely due to heat as well. Carbon buildup in the head and the skirt wear on the piston are indicative of an engine that was running too lean and lost valve seal. The cylinder head and barrel are now headed to LA sleeve for reconditioning. A new piston will be installed during reassembly. The Honda XR650R motorcycle is known for its reliability and longevity, and that's what our aim is with this top-end rebuild. Part 1 covered the engine teardown, and now we're about to remove the piston. Before engine reassembly, remove the circlip with a needle nose pliers. The pin should come out by hand force, and if not, use a pin remover from a company like ProMotion. Pat and protect the connecting rod and check it for end play and side play. Move the rod laterally for side play and up and down to check the end play. The cylinder barrel has been re-sleeved and honed by LA Sleeve. A replacement cast piston from Los Angeles Piston Company will work well in this application. We're looking for longevity and reliability. Los Angeles Sleeve Company provided the piston pin, clips, and this finished ring set that does not require filing of end gaps. The rings come pre-gapped, ready for installation. The piston pin slides freely through the small end of the connecting rod. Oil clearance is the only play that should be felt. Stay within the manufacturer's tolerances. Piston to cylinder clearance was assured by the precision honing of the cylinder by LA Sleeve. Installing piston rings by hand can minimize the risk of damaging the rings by overexpanding them. It also gives you an opportunity to control the ring as you're putting it into place, and minimizing the risk of damage to the piston as well. Side rails on the oil ring are staggered according to the instructions that come with the piston rings, and the ring end gaps are typically spaced 120 degrees apart, without aligning with either the piston pin or perpendicular to the piston pin. Installing the piston ring as demonstrated here minimizes the amount of stretch on the ring. Be cautious as you lower the ring past the piston edges not to scratch or damage the side or edge of the piston. Piston rings are marked for top side, and this top ring has a chamfered inner ledge that faces toward the top. Compressing cylinder gases push that top ring outward at the ledge. The rings are staggered the 120 degree spacing between their end gaps, and the oil control rails are staggered from each side of the spacers joined ends. Proper spacing and alignment of the rings is important. Take the time to follow the instructions from the manufacturer. Here, the first circlip snaps into place, its open end offset from the access gap. Permatex Ultra Slick engine assembly lube is used for coating the piston pin bosses, and the small end of the connecting rod during assembly. This will prevent friction and engine damage during the initial startup of the engine. Notice that the sides of the rod are protected with shop towels. Lower the piston into position carefully. The piston pin is a finger press fit through the pin bosses. Make sure that the eye on the top of the piston crown faces toward the intake side. Install the second circlip carefully and make sure the circlips are seated completely. Use care not to damage the aluminum alloy. In this application, the pin should move freely in the bosses and the rod. A new cylinder base gasket is now in place. Lube guard is an excellent way to lubricate piston rings and other critical friction areas for initial startup of the engine. Lube guard will find its way into the piston rings, ring lands, and other tight-fitting areas. An excellent lubricant for both engine and transmission work, Lube guard is also an excellent oil for the freshly machined cylinder wall crosshatch. The piston, rings, and the cylinder are now ready for assembly. This coolant passage O-ring must seal properly. In the frame, gently spread the studs apart to get the barrel in place. Move the barrel into position and then carefully lower it over the studs. Feed the timing chain up through the cylinder and use a mechanics wire to tie the chain to the handlebar. The chamfer at the bottom of the cylinder barrel enables compressing the rings with your fingers and allowing that tapered edge to catch the ring as you feed the piston carefully up into the barrel. Use extreme care not to damage rings or cause any kind of binding as the ring compresses and moves into the cylinder. When all of the rings and ring spacers are compressed, you'll be able to carefully lift the piston up into the barrel. Never force these parts or you will damage the rings. Make sure that the rings stay in alignment as you squeeze the piston up into the barrel. At this point, you can turn the flywheel carefully and the cylinder and piston will lower onto the crankcase. Always be certain that the locating dowel pins are in alignment with the cylinder and that these pins are round and will be able to keep the cylinder and piston on center. Protect the cylinder base gasket. Install these two cylinder base bolts and snug them down. You'll retorque them later. Lube guard at the top of the piston and around the cylinder is a good idea. Also lube the chain with the excess of lube guard oil. To prevent fouling the spark plug, run the piston to top dead center and wipe off any excesses of oil. At the cylinder top deck where the head gasket must seat and seal properly. Make sure that the piston moves freely up and down the cylinder. This will coat the crosshatch with fresh oil. Keep wiping off the excesses of oil and make sure that the deck surface is completely dry before installing the head gasket. Install the timing chain guide. Make sure that it notches properly and seats in the crankcase and the cylinder. The timing chain must move freely with the crankshaft. A quality Wiseco head gasket, an MLS style, and new dowel pins are installed on top of the cylinder. Make sure the gasket is perfectly clean. Make sure the dowel pins are located properly and seated. The troubles with this XR650R engine began with intake valves damaged from poor air filtration. LA Sleeve completely rebuilt this cylinder head and installed two new intake valves, reground the exhaust valves, and refurbished all of their parts before surfacing the head, which will mate perfectly with this new head gasket. This MLS Wiseco head gasket assures a perfect seal on this liquid-cooled engine with 10:1 compression ratio. Carefully seat the head. Don't force parts, go from one side back to the other, and bring the head down uniformly before installing stud, washers, and nuts. Lubricate the nuts before installation using Lube Guard or similar lubricant to assure that there's no friction and you'll get an accurate setting when adjusting final torque with a torque wrench. Note how easily each of these nuts turns. Lube Guard assures that there's no binding and torque settings will be very accurate. These nuts will be tightened in 4 stages. Starting at a very low level, tightening will be in cross to assure that the gasket flattens and that there's no risk tilting or cocking the head during tightening. Torque will be uniform and brought up gradually in 4 distinct stages. To reach a final torque of 49 foot-pounds, we began at 15 foot-pounds, went to 30 foot-pounds, then to 40 foot-pounds, then to 49 foot-pounds. Once at 49 foot-pounds, the nuts are allowed to rest, and then 49 pounds is rechecked 2 more times to be certain that the nuts are holding their torque. This uniform and rechecked torque will assure that this MLS Wiseco head gasket will seal properly and for a very long time. Unlike other head gaskets, this Wiseco MLS gasket will not only seal well, but does not require retorquing. This is a major asset considering how much work is involved in removing the cylinder head cover on these engines. Always use a quality torque wrench. Whether a click type, flex bar, or digital readout torque wrench, the wrench must be accurate and should be checked for calibration periodically. Whether you step up for forged pistons or other high-performance items, the quality of gaskets is crucial. You don't want coolant or oil leaks in the middle of nowhere, or to find that the engine has to be torn down at some time prematurely. Gaskets and seals of high quality are always a good investment and your assurance that the engine will be reliable when you need it to be. Extra time spent with torquing and tightening fasteners to specifications listed in the Honda service manual is time well spent. A practical approach is to visualize where you're going to be riding this motorcycle. And in the case of a Honda XR650R, you could find yourself in remote country awfully fast. Given that, you don't want to cut corners here. This is how to be sure that a head gasket will not fail in service. The next step is a plunger assembly that's part of the auto decompression system. Here we're installing the plunger and spring and snap ring. The snap ring is fragile. Be careful when you're handling it and installing the snap ring in the bore. The original equipment camshaft on the Honda XR650R uses an auto decompression system. For a variety of reasons, we chose a replacement camshaft from Hawk Cams. This is a Stage 1 camshaft that will be used in place of the original equipment auto decompression camshaft. Here, ultra slick engine assembly lube is placed on the lobes of the camshaft to prevent damage during the initial startup. Here are some tips for placing the Honda XR650R piston at top dead center, TDC, for setting the valve timing. Setting valve timing always begins with the piston at top dead center, or TDC. TDC is when the piston is at its highest point in the cylinder. Rotate the crankshaft in its normal direction of rotation until the piston reaches this highest point. With the rocker cover and spark plug removed, the following illustrations cover the common methods for placing the XR650R piston at TDC. Note that if the timing chain tensioner is not installed, you should be sure to rotate the crankshaft in its normal running direction when bringing the piston to TDC. Bring the piston up slowly and stop at TDC. If you pass TDC, rotate the crankshaft another full rotation and bring the piston slowly up to TDC. A caution: do not allow the timing chain to bind or jam up while rotating the crankshaft. Use care and keep the chain engaged with the crankshaft sprocket as you rotate the crankshaft. If the cylinder head is installed, you can shine a bright light down the spark plug threaded hole as you watch the piston rise slowly. Turn the crankshaft very slowly in its normal running direction until the piston just reaches the highest point in the cylinder. With the left side cover, the stator cover, removed, another method is to rotate the crankshaft by turning the flywheel by hand. Bring the piston slowly to the highest point in its travel. This is TDC. You will find a mark at the back side of the flywheel that indexes with a reference point on the XR650R engine crankcase. When setting valve timing, always rotate the crankshaft in its normal running direction. Rotate the flywheel counterclockwise as you look directly at it. If the stator cover is in place, you can use the factory T mark on the flywheel as your TDC piston reference. Finding TDC for valve timing is just like finding TDC for ignition spark timing. You observe the flywheel T mark through the spark timing verification hole in the side or stator cover. If the stator cover is in place, remove the timing plug from the side cover and watch the rotation of the flywheel through the spark timing inspection hole. When building a racing engine, piston TDC can be measured precisely with a 2-stroke engine timing tool and a dial indicator through the spark plug hole. For setting the valve timing on an XR650R engine with a stock, non-adjustable timing sprocket, you can establish piston TDC with just a visual check. Note the degrees of spacing on the camshaft sprocket teeth. If the piston is 1 or so thousandths of an inch above or below TDC, this will not cause a valve timing adjustment error with the stock timing sprocket. Try to be as accurate as possible and keep slack out of the timing chain on the normal pull side. By rotating the crankshaft slowly, you can keep tension on the pull side of the timing chain to get an accurate valve timing check. If the piston goes past TDC, be sure to remove any slack from the pull side of the timing chain while returning the piston to TDC. If unsure, turn the crankshaft backward 90 degrees, then bring the piston back to TDC very slowly. Slack will pull out of the chain as you rotate the crankshaft in its normal rotational direction. Always recheck valve timing after you install the timing chain tensioner. Turn the crankshaft several rotations, at least 3 complete rotations, and then bring the piston up slowly to TDC. Verify that the timing marks on the sprocket are in line with the cylinder head rocker box parting line. When looking directly at the valve timing marks on the timing chain sprocket, the E or EX faces to the right. The I or IN faces left. This refers to the exhaust and intake valve locations in the cylinder head. Done properly, the piston will be at TDC. The camshaft lobes will be facing downward. The timing sprocket marks will align with the cylinder head rocker box parting line, and the timing chain will have no slack on its pull side, the side facing toward the front of the motorcycle. The Stage 1 camshaft does not require the auto decompression plunger. That gets removed in this case. Otherwise, the camshaft installation is identical to the stock cam. Here, Loctite 242 is applied to the screws that hold the camshaft timing sprocket in place. Loctite 242 is absolutely essential. These screws cannot come loose. Here is the top dead center timing mark with the stator cover removed. Make sure the camshaft lobes are facing downward. With the piston at exact top dead center, the sprocket should align with the E to the right, the I to the left, with the camshaft lobes facing downward. A universal 2-pin spanner can be used to hold the sprocket. Rotate the flywheel counterclockwise and always tension the chain on this side as you check the timing marks. The front bearing stops against the stop pin. Install new O-rings and seals. This is an original equipment Honda part. The O-ring is on the passageway between the cylinder head and the rocker cover. This is a timing chain tensioner. A small screwdriver can be used to retract the plunger. Use Loctite 242 on the threads of the bolts and Permatex Ultra Slick engine assembly lube on the plunger tip. Make sure to retract the plunger when starting the screws and tightening the screws. Avoid putting a strain on these threads. They are going into an alloy cylinder and could be easily stripped. The tensioner is tightened evenly, one bolt then the opposite bolt, a small amount at a time, with the plunger retracted for each new set of the threads. The gasket has been coated lightly with Permatex Superflex to assure that it will seal properly without sloughing sealant into the engine. Keep the plunger retracted as you set the final torque on the 2 bolts. Unload the plunger as you set the torque with a torque wrench. Torque the tensioner bolts evenly. Now you can load the tensioner and install the plug and sealing washer into the tensioner end. Snug up the plug to prevent seepage of oil. Recheck the torque on the lower cylinder bolts. Make sure the timing is aligned properly. With the piston at top dead center, check the marks, E to the right, I to the left, with the tension on the correct side of the sprocket and the camshaft lobes pointing downward. Place a dab of Permatex Ultra Slick on the tips of the valve stems. Spray Lube Guard on the valve stem and spring areas for initial startup of the engine. Coat the timing chain sprocket and timing chain with Lube Guard or similar thin oil. Confirm the valve timing with the piston at top dead center, lobes pointed downward, timing marks aligned. Dab Ultra Slick on the rocker arm tips. Lucas break-in oil with zinc is important. Added in the right proportion for the crankcase capacity, this oil will help with camshaft lobe break-in. Use gasket cinch or recommended sealant between the rocker box and the cylinder head. Coat evenly and not in excess. You don't want sealant to slough off into the engine and find its way to the oil pickup screen. Make sure that there will not be any leaks between the rocker box cover and the cylinder head. 2 even coats would be advised. Gasket cinch can even set up for a few moments before installing the rocker box cover. Wipe off excess and any drips. Make sure that the gasket cinch is evenly coating the rocker box and the cylinder head contact surfaces. Gasket cinch is easy to wipe up and remove. Make sure the camshaft bearings are seated and pull them to the outer edge of the bearing saddles. Make sure the dowel pins are in place and that they're round and true. A thin and uniform coating of gasket cinch on the camshaft end plug assures a leak-proof rocker box installation. Set the rocker box in place carefully to avoid smearing gasket cinch or equivalent sealant. Coat bolt threads with sealant thinly and uniformly. Make sure sealing washers are in top condition or replace them with new. These are the 2 larger bolts at the center of the rocker box cover. Use care when starting bolts in the alloy threads. Bolts are in graduated sizes and lengths. It's easy to identify the outer bolts by their slight oxidation. The 2 bolts without oxidation on their heads fit inside the rocker box covers. Account for all hardware. One way to avoid confusion is to set the hardware aside in exactly the same positions as the original installation. Use a piece of cardboard and make a pattern. Press the screws and bolts through the cardboard in the positions that they originally came out. This will help during the installation to keep the hardware separated and ready to go back in its proper place. The standing height of the bolts is an indication of how much thread each bolt will penetrate. Make sure this is uniform and very clearly that you have the right bolt and sealing washer in the correct location. The first bolts to tighten are the larger ones at the center of the cover. You'll make them snug, not tight at this point. Just take up the threads. Torque should be set in 4 distinct stages, following a cross pattern, beginning with the larger bolts and working your way out in cross from the center to the outer edges of the rocker box. Take up bolts evenly. These are precisely machined mating surfaces. You don't want to warp the rocker box cover. Uniformly and snugly tighten up bolts in the cross pattern, working your way from the center outward in cross. Take your time here. Keep the 100 mile from nowhere rule in mind. 100 miles from nowhere, do you want any leaks or problems with the rocker box cover? As you seat the bolts, be certain that the rocker arms move freely. To get the proper torque settings, you don't want the rocker arms to be tensioned against the valve springs. Now, the torque wrench comes into play. The sequence remains the same, working from the center bolts outward and cross. Note the torque for the different size bolts and bring them up in steps and stages. 3 or 4 graduated steps assure an accurate and uniform final torque setting. Larger bolts can be tightened with a foot-pound torque wrench, while the smaller bolts are best tightened with an inch-pound torque wrench. In these torque ranges, that would be a 1/4 inch drive inch-pound torque wrench and a 3/8 drive foot-pound torque wrench, as shown here. Always make sure that your torque wrench is accurate and in calibration. Click type, beam bar, or the later LED light readout torque wrenches can each be accurate. Make sure your wrenches are in calibration. Work your way up to final torque in graduated steps, always using the cross pattern and starting with the center bolts, working your way out to the outer edges of the rocker box cover in cross. Especially with alloy threads common to motorcycle engine assemblies, always be careful when tightening. Never over tighten, and recheck the torque rather than over tightening the bolts. After reaching the final torque setting in cross, allow the hardware to set for a few minutes and then re-torque all of the bolts in sequence and in cross. This assures that all hardware is seated properly and will seal the cylinder head and rocker box cover. Valve adjustment is an important part of motorcycle maintenance. Whether rebuilding the top end of an engine or performing routine service, valve adjustment is a critical part of the process. The Honda XR650R motorcycle engine is a 4-stroke with conventional rocker arms and adjusters. With the piston at top dead center on the compression stroke, you can check the clearance between the rocker arm adjuster and the tip of the valve stem. Use a box end wrench to loosen the lock nut on the adjuster. Back the adjuster screws off enough to insert the blade 0.6 of an inch feeler gauge. On this 4-valve engine, both intake valves open and close simultaneously. Valve adjustment is always performed with a completely cold engine. For this engine application, a 45-degree feeler blade is essential. Insert the blade parallel to the valve stem tip. It should fit flatly between the rocker arm adjuster and the tip of the valve stem. Make sure that the blade is not angled. The idea is to just take the clearance out of that space between the blade and the adjuster. Parallel to the adjuster and the valve stem tip, there should be a slight drag of the blade as you move it back and forth under the adjuster. If in doubt about the slight amount of drag, try a 0.007 feeler gauge and a 0.005 feeler gauge. The 0.005 feeler gauge should feel loose. The 0.007 feeler gauge may not enter that space, and if it does, it will be a tight fit. Learning the sensation of a slight drag is an important part of valve adjustment. When tightening the adjuster lock nut, even with the adjuster screw held steadily, you may discover adjustment is slightly loose, and this is because of the space between the threads of the adjuster and the rocker arm. As you tighten the lock nut, it pulls the adjuster screw up slightly and can sometimes create a looser feel at the blade. If this occurs, you need to tighten the adjuster screw slightly more. Honda calls for 18 foot-pounds of torque on the adjuster lock nut. If you're uncertain what 18 foot-pounds is, use a torque wrench. If you're familiar with the use of a box end wrench and torque, you can tighten the nut securely with a box end wrench. Both intake valves adjusted now, we move to the exhaust valves. Here, the clearance is wider at 0.008 of an inch. The engine is still at top dead center on the compression stroke, which means that valves have maximum clearance and the camshaft lobes are facing downward. Here, the lock nuts are tight, and the use of a ratchet and socket places rotational force on the nut and reduces the stress on the rocker arm and rocker shaft mechanism. Once again, the blade must be parallel to the valve tip and the rocker adjuster screw. Always hold the adjuster screw steadily when tightening the lock nut. Expect that there may be some variation between the lock nut tight and the lock nut loose. It is often helpful to turn the screw slightly with the adjuster nut tightening to slightly tighten the adjuster to the blade. This compensates for slack in the threads and also aids in making that ultra fine adjustment. Keep in mind again that the adjuster screw threads may pull or lift up slightly as you set the torque on the lock nut. The important setting is the adjuster with the lock nut secure, so always recheck the clearance after tightening the lock nut. Slight drag with the blade parallel to the valve tip and the adjuster screw is the goal here. It takes patience to adjust valves. Take your time and make sure that the lock nut is secure before making the final check. Valve clearances are identical between each of the valves. Again, the intake valves have 0.06 of an inch clearance. The exhaust valves have 0.08 of an inch clearance. This is 0.15 millimeters on the intake side and 0.20 millimeters on the exhaust side. On these clearances, Honda allows a plus or minus of 1/1000th of an inch on the intake and exhaust sides and 0.02 millimeters plus or minus on those valves. If you need to rotate the crankshaft to bring the piston up to top dead center, or to cycle the rocker arms through several rotations to make sure that the arms and all parts are in alignment, lift the rear wheel of the motorcycle off the rack and remove the spark plug. Place the transmission in a higher gear, second or third will do, even fourth, and rotate the tire in a forward rotation very slowly while watching the timing mark come up. Bump the tire gently to bring the T mark into alignment carefully. Use a higher gear to move the flywheel slower. Remember to reduce the amount of tension on the rocker arms if the lock nut is too tight. Use a ratchet and socket for rotational force instead of tugging hard at the rocker arm. If you need to rotate the crankshaft during a valve adjustment, make sure you maintain proper valve timing by rotating the rear tire only in a forward direction. Always rotate the rear wheel in a forward direction to be certain that the timing chain is pulling the valve timing correctly. You want no slack in the chain, while making sure that the camshaft timing is accurate for top dead center on the compression stroke. On this engine, the exhaust valves needed attention because the freshly ground valves and new seats had lifted the valve stem higher in the head. This required loosening the adjusters. Here, a light film of lube guard on the valve cover O-ring helps assure a proper seal and preserves the O-ring. Install the valve covers, tightening screws evenly to prevent warpage or damage to the O-ring or the mating surfaces. Tighten these bolts to 9 foot-pounds torque using your torque wrench. Tighten evenly and in cross and bring the tension up uniformly. This is all part of a periodic valve adjustment that is necessary to compensate for valve seat recession and wear of moving parts over time. Proper valve clearance adjustment assures accurate valve timing and also prevents the burning of valves that are set too tightly. When valve clearance is too loose, there's not enough valve lift, and valve timing duration is also affected. So for maximum performance and maximum longevity of the engine, it is essential that valves be adjusted periodically. The Honda service intervals are every 600 miles or 1,000 kilometers for inspecting the valve clearance. This may not require adjustment during each valve adjustment check. Keep in mind that any major change in valve clearance could be an indication of engine trouble. Valve adjustment is very much a part of 4-stroke motorcycle maintenance. Use a new O-ring on the coolant elbow going into the cylinder head. Coat the threads, in this case with gasket cinch. This is a quick way to assure a uniform and equal amount of sealant on a pair of bolts. Again, start all hardware carefully. These steel threads are going into an alloy cylinder head. Tighten by hand and cross. Bring up the threads evenly. Keep the elbows centered as you tighten one side to the other. Here, an inch-pound torque wrench, click type, works well for final torque setting. Spark plug threads are 19 mm or 3/4 inch reach. Make sure you start the spark plug by hand, carefully. Gap the plug properly before installation. When you insert the socket, make sure that you keep it centered over the top of the spark plug. Use a torque wrench for final torque setting and seating the plug against the cylinder head. Final torque is 13 foot-pounds. The stator cover gasket is in top condition. With dowel locating pins, this gasket can be reseated in its original position. Gasket cinch helps renew the gasket surface, making it supple, as well as acting as a sealant. A thin and even coating of gasket cinch will renew the gasket and provide a safe seal. Any signs of wear, or if there is any doubt about the condition of the gasket, replace it with a new gasket. Always renew the head gasket and any O-rings. Gasket cinch is our sealant of choice for these stator cover screws. Start the screws by hand and tighten them snugly in cross. Bring the screw tension up evenly in steps until all of the screws are snug. Then follow with a torque wrench, in this case an inch-pound torque wrench. The click-type torque wrench is fast and accurate in this kind of parts assembly. Remaining hardware can be installed. The use of gasket cinch on threads prevents oxidation. Here, this screw is tightened with the bracket held in place. A torque wrench will be used for final torque setting. This 1/4 inch driver doubles as an extension for use of the torque wrench. Check all grommets to make sure they're sealing properly. Install the clutch cable in the original position. This is a good time to adjust the clutch at both the bracket end and the clutch lever. Secure the hold-down bolt and torque the bolt to the proper specification. Once the bolt is torqued, you can check the lever free play to make sure that the clutch lever has adequate movement at this end of the adjustment. Install the compression release bracket. Torque that bolt to specification. This is one of the rocker cover bolts. This non-California model came with the prized open intake manifold. Here the carburetor is inserted into the airbox inlet and pressed outward and then into the intake manifold. Seat the manifold carefully before tightening the clamp. Make sure that the manifold seals completely to keep dirt out of the intake stream. Level the carburetor using the float bowl line as a guide. Secure the clamp screws, keeping in mind that dirt must be kept out of the engine. Snug up the clamps uniformly. Do not over-tighten, but make sure the bands are in their grooves and the seal is complete. Here, the carburetor is checked for level. All cables must move freely without binding. Install the upper engine support brackets between the frame and the top of the cylinder head cover. Use blue Loctite 242 on the nuts. Here, the torque wrench is used as a ratchet. To torque accurately, torque from the nut side and not from the bolt side. Make sure all 3 nuts are secure and at proper torque. Let them set for a minute and then recheck the torque. This bracket must be secure. Be sure that all wiring is in place and out of the way neatly, including the spark plug wire, cables, and other wires. Clean up the exhaust pipe flanges with Scotch-Brite and install new O-rings in the exhaust ports. Permatex anti-seize compound will prevent the flange nuts from seizing. A light coating of anti-seize makes it easier to assemble the pipes as well. Install the right side flange and header first, and leave all of these parts loose until you get the entire system bolted together. Use care not to damage the radiator fins if the radiator is close to the exhaust flange. Note that this is still loose until all of the pieces are bolted together. Center up the flange in the port before tightening these nuts. Airbox seal is very important. Here we are restoring the original air filtration system to make certain that the airbox, filter, and anti-backfire trap are in place and working properly. The need for a top engine rebuild on this low-hour XR650R Honda was strictly the result of an air filter that was not doing its job. An original equipment Honda air filtration system is more than adequate for our usage. The new filter comes pre-oiled. Note that the airbox restrictors have been removed. This motorcycle is uncorked. The side cover is completely stock to make certain that the seal at the air filter is adequate. The splatter baffle is new and installed carefully. The cooling system is flushed with deionized distilled water. Flushed and drained, the system will be refilled with Honda Premix, ethylene glycol-based antifreeze, without silicates or harmful additives. Valves adjusted and valve covers in place. Inspect the entire engine and all cabling. Make sure all parts are accounted for and wiring is safely routed. Check the cooling system. Make sure the drains and all hoses are intact. Brackets and breather hoses must be in place. Secure the radiator halves and make sure that hardware is in place and torqued properly. Retorque the exhaust flanges to make sure that the exhaust system will seal. Be certain all hardware is in place. This muffler has a low restriction Honda tailpipe, part of the uncorking of the exhaust system. Seat and fuel tank reinstalled, fresh top end, uncorked, with a stage 1 hot cams camshaft. Proper tuning should produce 55 horsepower and approximately 50 pound-feet of torque.